happy to see everybody here. I was worried everybody was going to sleep in. It's beautiful out. It's a weekend. I wanted to be on the beach, so thank you for coming in on your weekend and hanging out with us. I really appreciate that. My name is Jason. I like to learn stuff. I like to teach stuff. I used to be at Gatsby. Before that I was at IBM. I currently I'm the host of an internet TV show. It's called Learn with Jason. It's pair programming, live streamed on Twitch a couple times a week. It's a lot of fun. You can watch it live. Please do. It's more fun when there are more people in the chat. So today, I want to talk about open source. And I want to start where it's fun to start, which is what's good about open source. Because open source is awesome. And a lot of that is because open source is everywhere. An enormous amount of the web is powered by open source. Is there anybody in this room who is not using a single line of open source code in their day-to-day work? Not a single hand goes up, right? Because open source has become a core part of the web development experience. We rely on open source for nearly everything. And we see that because WordPress, React, Drupal, Angular, jQuery, Bootstrap, like everything shows up in the open source world. It's a really wonderful and powerful thing. It's also just good business. Open source is a great way to access thousands of developers' collective skill. If you create a popular open source product, you are going to attract contributors from around the world. They're going to test your open source library at scale. And they're going to help you identify and fix edge cases that it would take you months or years to do in-house. So that's you can look at the strength of something like React and how Facebook has been able to attract thousands of developers to come in and say, hey, we did it like this, it didn't work, here's a PR, right? It's a really, really powerful model to drive a large group of people together to solve common problems. You get to reduce your development and maintenance costs. If you're a company that is paying, hundreds of developers, that's a lot of overhead. If you're a company that's 10 developers with an open source product and a strong community, those open source community members are going to help improve your core product without charging a salary. And they do that because the community is strong. They get something out of this open source product being good, and you get reduced overhead by having something that's valuable to other people. You also get to build goodwill with the community, or in certain cases, like with Microsoft, Microsoft was able to almost entirely overhaul its image with open source. And that's a really powerful thing that you can do. Companies like Facebook, despite the fact that Facebook kind of gets a bad rep for privacy and for ruining democracy, they still have a lot of community goodwill because of things like React and GraphQL that they've put out into the dev community. And it also gives you the ability to attract and retain talent. People get excited to go work at companies that have prominent projects. You want to be a member of the Google team or the Facebook team and work on some of these open source projects. It's very inviting and very attractive to go work on an open source project because you get a chance to interact and influence thousands of developers, millions of developers around the globe. Open source is also empowering for individuals. You get to create a body of work that is really impressive. And whether or not it should be is a different discussion. But if you can go into a job interview and show a lot of open source contributions, that is a definite advantage. You also get to build a referral network for paid work. If you have a lot of open source work, that draws attention to you, which helps you land paid work because it's credibility boosting. And you can turn that into a sustainable source of income. You can do that by selling support for an open source library, or you can do it by leveraging it into a job. There are ways to turn your open source contributions into a reliable source of income. However, as you may have expected, there's a but. There are actually a few buts. First is that open source is daunting. Getting into open source is intimidating on many levels. First we've got the kind of trope that open source is unfriendly. This is an email from everybody's favorite open source jerk, Linus Torvalds. And as you can see, he's very, very friendly to his contributors, right? And Linus has since apologized and has said he's seeking help to treat people better, which I think is a great sign. But this reputation persists. The idea that going into open source is potentially opening yourself up for abuse from strangers. Open source is intimidating on multiple levels. Like if you walk into a big project, it's thousands of lines of code, it's tons of required context and history. You are basically walking into something that you've never really seen, and then you're trying to make changes. And because it's open source, you're a volunteer. You're not going in there with hundreds of hours to ramp up and level up on this tool. You're basically trying to do something quickly, usually on your nights and weekends. You don't have time to spend hundreds of hours leveling up. On top of that, open source is just built on a challenging stack. Learning something like Git takes time. Figuring out how to do Git branching properly in an open source context is challenging. There are expectations, and they're not necessarily very clear or well laid out for a lot of projects. And then you have to get into GitHub, and if you've never used GitHub before, now you're up against a whole other set of things. What is like master versus a feature branch? What does it mean to merge upstream changes? What does a pull request actually mean? If you've never done these things before, these are new, it's all jargon. And this interface is a complete mystery if you've never used it before. I remember struggling a lot with GitHub when I first started. Now that I've done it for a while, I'm like, oh yeah, it's GitHub. But I've watched new people come into projects and try to use the GitHub interface, and they're like, I have no idea what any of these buttons or any of these words mean. And then there's just all the awkward social dynamics in general. What you're doing when you do open source is you're effectively walking into a room full of strangers and you're saying, hi, can I touch your stuff? And that's a weird experience, right? Because you're walking into a room full of people who have been working on something for a long time, and then you're proposing as a complete stranger that I want to change that code. And it's all done usually in a spirit of trying to make things better, but at the same time, they don't know you, and you don't know them, and you don't know how they're going to, respond to you saying, I like your idea, but I'd like it to be better. And this introduces a lot of problems. We've got things like imposter syndrome. This is a tweet that I love. Imposter syndrome is holding two ideas in your head at the same time. First, you're surrounded by people in the community who are incredibly intelligent, right? They're the best and brightest in the industry, and they're all so much smarter than you. But imposter syndrome also tells you that you, the incompetent person, have somehow managed to fool all of them, right? And so it's this very, there's a duality to it, and it undercuts a lot of your confidence and your willingness and ability to continue. So we need to work through that. There's also just this experience where you send a PR and the maintainer is overwhelmed or frustrated, and they close it with no comment, or they close it and just say wrong. And that's not going to get you to want to come back. There are issues with people who didn't mean to be rude getting bombarded with issues, and so they get short. Or somebody else is mean to them, but you showed up next, and so you get the brunt of that. Those are all risks in open source. On top of that, open source is an expense not everyone can afford. Open source is typically something that gets done in people's hobby time. And not everybody wants code to also be their hobby. Some of us want our hobbies to be hobbies, right? And so we may not have free time to work on open source. It may not be something that we're able to do as part of our job. That can pose a big problem, especially when open source starts to become something of a requirement for getting a job. You have to be able to show open source experience on your resume. I don't have time always to go out and do a bunch of work. If it wasn't part of my job, my GitHub contribution graph would be 2 little green squares, right? My hobbies are not code. And so then we get into, and these are just like the professional issues. Now let's talk about the personal issues. Not everyone sees themselves represented in open source. If you open up a GitHub contributors list, chances are you're going to see a lot of 1 or 2 demographics in there. And for somebody who's trying to get into open source, that's not sending the signal that this is the place for them. So that doesn't feel great, right? So with all these things being said, is open source actually open? Are we actually creating an open source community? And I'd argue that we're not always doing a good job of that. And that's a real tragedy because when you think about this, the community in open source is everything. If we get that wrong, it's going to be a bad time for the project, it's going to be a bad time for us. So we need to make sure that we are keeping the community healthy. We can't just work on the code, it has to be about the people who are involved in the community. How many of you have an open source project that has no stars and nobody really opens issues, you're the only maintainer, right? I've got a bunch of them. How valuable do you feel like those projects are? Do you feel like you are getting a huge amount of return on those open source projects that you're the only person who uses? I don't. The ones that feel a return are the ones where I've gathered people together or where I've joined a community of people who want to be part of that open source project. That's when it gets valuable. So it's not the code, it's the people. And if we want to create a community, if we want to attract people, we have to be proactive. You can't just sit back and wait. This is not an if you build it, they will come kind of thing. So we have to actively reach out and welcome people into our community. We need to remember that not everybody's where we are. We saw Carolyn talk about this yesterday. We have learned things, and once we've learned something, it's easy to assume that that thing is simple. And then we talk to people who haven't learned it as if it should be simple, and we make them feel unintelligent or like they should be further than they are. That's not a good feeling. That's not what you want to be. We have to invest in our community as a primary success metric. If you are a company and you're looking at open source, you shouldn't be breaking down your open source projects to a monetary ROI. If you're looking at your repos and saying stars equate to X number of dollars of lifetime customer value, you're doing it wrong. You have to look at the community itself as the thing that you're measuring the health of, because community does not have a direct return on investment. It has a second, third, and fourth order effect. So we have to let those ripples go out. And you can't measure ripples in that sense. You have to measure the health of the community, and then those ripples will cause the returns. Because if we get this wrong, we lose a lot. We lose so many brilliant people who wanted to help but didn't know how to start, or who wanted to help and had a bad interaction that set things the wrong way and left them feeling left out or unwelcome, and they just never come back. They just don't do open source. They say, hey, open source isn't for me. Somebody was mean to me one time. I'm not going to do it anymore. That's a tragedy, because there's so many smart people who would have so much to offer if they were just felt more welcome. We also lose the opportunity to spread out the maintenance burden. It is awful to be the sole maintainer of a popular project. We've watched as multiple solo maintainers have burned out in spectacular fashion because they feel unappreciated, they feel overworked, they feel like nobody's helping them. And if you build a good community, you get that support. So you want to make sure that you're not driving people away. If we get it wrong, you lose the opportunity for that support. And you just lose the opportunity to build a support network in general. One of my favorite things, one of the only things that I like about working in an office, like I'm full-time remote. So when I work with a team in the same place, one of my absolute favorite things is the shared context and conversation that I have with my coworkers. I want to sit down with somebody who knows the things that I know, who's experienced the things that I experience, and I can just vent a little bit. I want to be able to complain and not have it be to my partner who's just smiling and nodding like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Yeah, that must really suck. That's not a fun conversation. I want somebody to be like, oh my God, I hate that guy, right? Like I need, I don't actually want to say any of that in public, but I need somebody who knows so that I can go to the bar and be upset once in a while. But we lose that if we're not welcoming, if we don't create that community, we don't build the connections that give us the space to be able to have those friendships and to be able to vent. So the first thing that we have to think about when we are looking at open source is that you belong here. And I mean that to literally everybody in this room, especially to everybody who just said, well, everybody, but not me. No, especially you. You belong in open source. You are welcome here. Not everybody's showing it the way that they should, but you absolutely 100% should be in open source. We would love to have you. So if we want to do this, if we want to embody this value of you belong here, again, this has to be active, right? So Fostering belonging in a community means that our communities need to be welcoming. They need to be compassionate. We have to be compassionate toward the people. We have to understand, remember, meet them where they are. And they have to be safe, right? And now safety on the internet's an interesting thing, because those of us who have never felt unsafe on the internet, probably this doesn't mean a lot to us, because we look at it and we go, well, it's safe. Like, yeah, I'm behind a computer. Who's going to punch me? But that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about emotional safety. When I walk into a room, if I express an opinion, do I feel like I'm going to be met with somebody saying, that's interesting, can you say more about that? Or is somebody going to say, well, actually, you're wrong, and here's why, right? Our communities need to be built around the idea of, in improv, there's this concept of yes and, where what you're doing is when somebody offers you something, an idea, feedback, you're not saying no, and here's why, or I'm right and you're wrong. You're saying, yes, I see what you're saying, and here's a question. Here, I want to clarify. I want to understand. You're collaborating as opposed to disagreeing, right? We have to do the work to build that. It's very easy when somebody tells me something that disagrees with what I believe for me to want to say, no, that's wrong. Here's why. So I have to stop. I have to listen, and I have to think, how did they get there? I want to understand. So I'm not going to say you're wrong. I'm going to say, can you say more about that? Can you tell me what you've got, like what steps brought you to that decision? I'd love to hear how you got there. And a lot of times you learn something and you realize that there's a whole corner of the project that you weren't thinking about, or a whole aspect to this conversation that was just over here out of your line of sight. And as soon as you notice it, you go, oh, you know what? That's really smart. We should do that. We should fix that. So, again, hold up, because I'm saying all this stuff, right? But we can't just say this stuff. If we stand up here and we wave our arms and we say, we champion diversity, we champion inclusion, we're here to make everybody feel welcome, and then we just go back to our computers and don't do it, we don't actively do it, we're just kind of, it's the idea of, like, if I get a poster that says, like, I love whatever group, I'm here, I support women in tech, and then I see a woman in tech being harassed and I just sit quietly, I'm not doing the work. I'm showing a banner and then I'm walking away, right? So we need to make sure that this is active. We can't just say it, we have to do it. A lot of times, engineers have a sense of problems being puzzles. We look at the things that we deal with as static problems that can be solved in a process-based way. We look at it and say, if I understand this problem and I organize the pieces in such and such a way, this will stay solved forever, right? And so a lot of times the instinct is to look at community like that. Well, if I write a code of conduct, that problem is solved. If I make a public statement, that problem is solved. But that's not how people work. People are not fixed. People are dynamic. People are organic. Communities are organic. They're growing and changing all the time, and we need to respond. That takes ongoing tending. So I like to think of community more like a campfire. A campfire is similar to a puzzle at first. It's something that you have to think about, what do we need to get this going? How do we initially solve this problem? But once you get a campfire going, you also have to do some work. You have to go find more wood. You have to, tend it and stir it around and make sure that it's staying healthy, that those flames are burning. But if we do that, we're not just helping ourselves. We're creating a space. We're creating something that will keep a whole community warm and welcome. We can all gather around that campfire. We can all gather around this community and say, hey, this is a place for me, right? And then we'll start to share that work. When you get a strong community, it's not one person doing all the work. It's not one person running off and cutting wood and chopping it up and stirring the fire. It's the whole community. Somebody goes, oh, I'll get a log. Somebody else says, oh, I'll get a log. We all chip in. And then the community starts to feed itself. Everybody chips in a little bit, and we all stay warm. We all feel like we belong. So it's not enough to just say our community is welcoming. We can't just go out and put that on our website. We have to back it up with action. We have to do things to make people feel welcome. So let's think about what that actually means. Let's get practical, because this is going to be applicable to your open source if you have a large open source project. It's going to be applicable to your internal teams. If you work in a company that has more than one team, it's going to be applicable to dealing with other teams. It's honestly, this is just like how people interact with each other, right? So invest in onboarding. Explain how to get started. Make it clear that there is a path to get started. It's not a magic secret club that you have to be inducted in with a secret robe in a dark room and candles. It's something that, hey, anybody who wants to, here's the path. Follow step 1, step 2, step 3, and you're in. That's it. You know, one-click sign up, right? We're trying to do that for a community. We want people to feel instantly welcome and have very clear steps to get there. We need to put our money where our mouth is with representation and inclusion. We need to make sure that we're not just saying, hey, we are a diverse and inclusive company, and then we've got a wall of white guys, right? That's not, we have to put our money where our mouth is. We have to actually hire those people. We have to give people a chance from every background. And we have to show gratitude in meaningful ways, right? We have to really go out and treat people. If I go and do some work and somebody is just like, okay, thanks, that doesn't feel good. But if I feel like they genuinely appreciated it, then I'm genuinely happy to have done that work. My reward for doing it is that someone saw value in it. So we need to make sure that when people do this work, that we show them that we see value in it. And we also need to build that trust and safety, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So let's talk about some ways that you can actually do an investment in onboarding. So you can write docs for your first-time contributors, and these can be very clear step-by-step. Lots of projects have done this. There's a contributing.md that you can create in a public repo, and it will show first-time contributors what they can do to get involved. Take some time, write that document, look at a company that's done a good job of it, and just take the idea. Cite them for having stolen it, but straight up steal it. Like, do a good job of writing onboarding docs for people. Label issues for beginner-friendly people who want to get involved. They're going to look for good first issue. They're going to look for help wanted. Take the time to do that. Write some context. Honestly, Kent C. Dodds is a thing that I like, where he has an issue called First Timers Only. And he writes issues where he's even almost solved the problem already. And he'll write down how to do it, and he'll say, I will only accept a pull request for this from a first-timer. And he links to docs on how to create your first pull request. He explains how to create the pull request and what you're going to be expected to do. And then he waits for somebody who's a first-time contributor to open a pull request and merges it. He's trying to get people actively involved. That's a great way to approach that problem. If you can, offer pair programming or mentorship. You can do this internally at your company, or you can do it externally through something like codingcoach.io. Find people that know something you don't and learn it from them. Find somebody who's trying to learn what you've learned and teach them. That's how communities work. It's this reciprocity. Pay it forward, ask for help when you need it, and everybody starts to understand that this is a safe place. I can say I don't know, and I can say I can help, and everybody respects that. They're all looking, everybody's at a different place in their journey. You definitely know something that would help somebody else, and somebody else definitely knows something that would help you. Don't look at it as, the elite and everybody else. Look at it as everybody having expertise on different things, and you can cross-pollinate, you can share that information. So when you talk about putting your money where your mouth is with representation, what we need in any healthy community is for the community to be fully represented in its leadership, right? So if you have an open source project, or if you have a company that deals with open source, don't talk about inclusion and diversity unless you're actively putting the work in to appoint leadership that represents the community. Your leadership should look just like the community that you're representing. I get nervous putting this slide up here because I'm standing up here as a white guy, and I always worry, like, are you really qualified to give this talk? Should I be the one up here? Like, shouldn't I have just given up my slot so that somebody from an underrepresented group could give this talk? And part of me is like, yeah, I definitely should have. And the other part of me is like, I should be doing this work. I shouldn't wait for somebody from an underrepresented group to show up and give the diversity and inclusion talk. I shouldn't wait for somebody who's not a white guy to stand up and say, hey, what about us? I need to be the one who says, hey, what about everybody else? We need to do this work, right? So do that work. On that vein, hold yourself publicly accountable, right? Say what you want to do in public and measure against those goals. Are you planning on, like a good example of this is Gatsby wrote an accessibility statement. Gatsby does not have perfect accessibility. It's not meeting all of the requirements. But Marcy Sutton on the team did an audit, wrote down where things currently are and where they want to be. And they are measuring progress regularly in public so people can see, is Gatsby actually making progress toward this goal? Or do they just say something and then ignore it, right? Put yourself on blast. Go out there and say, we're going to solve these problems, and then go solve them. You have to actually do the work. If you, again, this is the metronome for this talk. If you're going to say that this is something that's important to you, you have to do the work. You have to show up. This has to be something that's at the top of your KPIs. This is not an afterthought. This is not something where you hire one person to be the champion of D&I or one person to be your community manager and then ignore it. This is something that takes everybody. It takes a village. It takes a community, right? Show gratitude in meaningful ways. This is something that is, it's really kind of close to my heart. It's one of the projects that I feel most proud of when I was at Gatsby. Make sure that when somebody shows up in your community that you notice and that you thank them. And not thank them in a like rote thanks merge, but in a way that's meaningful, right? If you're a business, allocate marketing budget to send swag or to make a donation to charity in the name of everybody who contributes to your project. This is something that I did at Gatsby. It's still in, I left Gatsby, but this is still in effect. Any contribution made to Gatsby, a first-time contributor will get a coupon for $10 in swag or the ability to donate to a charity of their choice. If you make 5 pull requests, you get a bigger coupon code. And those, it's not much, but it's something. It's paying attention. It's saying, hey, we know that you put your time into this, and we want to say thank you. Also, it gave me an excuse to design pajama pants, which I feel like was really the highlight of my career. Okay, so next you want to build trust and safety. And so when you talk about trust and safety, give people the benefit of the doubt. Trust first. Like, trust but verify. Invite people to your GitHub organization, and then use code owners to make sure that nobody's going to break core logic or delete all the tests. You need a core team, kind of a leadership body, that is always there to have checks and balances in place, but invite people to the org. Like, there's no reason not to do that. Default to transparency. There should never be an argument that says, well, why should we share this? The only time that argument should come up is when you're saying, why should we not share this? You should always default to public. Create clear channels for feedback. It should be extremely obvious where people should go if they have questions, if something goes wrong, if they are feeling uncomfortable. They should know exactly who to talk to, what channel to go through. Do they email someone? Is there an anonymous text message they can send? Something they can do? They need to know. And then you need to define clear processes for handling problems, because again, you can't just say we have a code of conduct. You need to say, if there's a code of conduct violation, this is the process, and then you need to follow that process. There can't be exceptions. You define it ahead of time, and that makes it much easier to not make kind of, oh, well, this person's really influential, so we'll cut them more slack than this person who's new. No, the rules apply to everybody. And then make space for quiet voices. This is one of the hardest things to do, because there are always people in any room, in any company, in any community who are willing to say everything that's on their mind. They'll share every idea. I'm one of them. I'm a very loud person. In meetings, I have a lot of ideas and I want to share them. It's something that I enjoy. But if I'm not careful, my sharing becomes shouting down someone else. So make sure that there are ways for people to share that don't involve making big public pronouncements that could expose them to unsolicited feedback or criticism that they don't want to get. Don't have meetings where the only way to really contribute is to shout over everybody else in the room. Make space for those quiet voices. I would highly recommend that everyone gets a copy of the culture code and reads it. This is going to be invaluable whether you are an open source maintainer or a team leader or just someone who wants to get better at dealing with the people around you. This will help you make better friends, honestly. Read April Wenzel's work on compassionate coding. The whole blog is a goldmine. She also offers consulting if you want to bring somebody in to help. And most importantly, just remember, you belong here. You are part of this community. Whether or not, you showed up to React India. You're part of the open source community. So that means you're in this with us. You got to do the work too. So let's make open source more open together. Let's build that campfire. Thank you very much.
This video recording was brought to you by Twilio. We allow you to integrate different means of communication such as video, chat, or SMS into your React applications. If you want to learn how you can send SMS directly from a React chat, check out this video on the right or go to our Twilio YouTube channel. And if you want to watch another React India talk, we picked one out just for you over here on the left. Thanks for watching!